Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings with a helping side of welcome and salutations to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan, Watty, and thank you for joining me today as we continue our epic, our great, or just really awesome security adventure. Thank you, as always, to producer Jeff for joining us as our main navigating light for this journey, and all of you who join in every week to show how side quests, how fun, how security happens. And if this is your first time, feel free to put in the chat where you're dialing in from, where you're tuning in from, where you're listening from, because we always like to know and hear and see. But I always like to reintroduce myself for you first time joiners because I am Tristan Watty. I come to you from the professional services division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way, while we say happy Monday to all, just like Ari does. And Mr. Thank you, Portland, Oregon. And we always like to have two, where you're from, but also another kind of question. And this question is an interesting one. So, what is your favorite dessert? I know this is kind of one of those things where you take that step back and you think about it. But for this episode, put your favorite dessert or your favorite retro console game. Either of those will suffice. So feel free to put in the chat your favorite dessert or your retro console game. For me, it is Mega Man. I'm kind of a Mega Man fan. So that is what we like to go with, where we like to start off with. And that's how we kind of go along the way. So to your question, how can I prepare myself for the AI practitioner exam in AWS? This is a great question. One starts with watching great shows like this on the Twitch and YouTube channels for AWS Live. The other place to start is the documentation. So getting familiar with the different pieces of what makes AI within AWS, what makes AI in general, and kind of going through and understanding those different components and the definitions will definitely help out in your security journey. And I also like to say hello, Victor. Nice to see you as always. And nice. That is a good one, Ari. So today's kind of adventure is this thing of looking forward, right? How do we power up? How do we level up when it comes to agentic AI and security? They're intertwined. They're interconnected. Just like a good peanut butter and hamburger sandwich. Ask me about it later. So where you start off with going through or going to is exactly where we start off with studying for that AI practitioners. Do we know the definitions? Do we know what agentic AI is? What autonomous security operations are? How can we achieve those? That's the interesting thing, because when you start to think about that, you start to go down the route of, hey, do I really understand what the next step is for me in my security journey? And do you understand that learning science is fun, like Victor? Thank you for that. So when you start to think, where do you go with this? And as Mr. says, I'm learning agentic AI. I want to explore how security will be implemented. This is a great place to start, because as you start to learn the definitions, the fundamentals, you start to think about, hey, what is the foundational capabilities that make your security trustworthy, right? It's the least privilege, the access, how you're protecting your data, all these things that pop up when you think about a security posture. And we always speak about target state security strategy here, because the security journey never really ends. It's just, hey, your security is in another castle. Go this way. Or you just leveled up. Here's some extra things to consider. Here's an extra skill tree. I'm going to use a couple of video game analogies because it's fun to do. And I think the other piece is just assessing your organizational readiness. Do you have that strategic roadmap? That's the question we take a pause for, because sometimes you don't know the answer. And that's okay because it's a journey. And we're trying to, figure out how to start said journey and how to continue on that journey together through the power of science, I would say, but also the power of just asking questions and figuring out, okay, if we were to go down the agentic AI path, what is kind of the scariest thing for us? Is it figuring out long-lived credentials and how we would handle it? Is it figuring out how do we have standing access to production? That's an interesting question because usually it's no, we have pipelines, we have all these other things in place. But this is the questions we start to ask ourselves when we start to have other mechanisms in place. We have to make sure that we have the correct, let's say, human in the loop capabilities for the maturity level of your organization, because there's an interesting kind of dichotomy of your maturity level as you start to add in more tools and kind of combine and centralize and do all these things of, okay, if we have human capabilities, how much of that is automated versus how much of it is human, and how do we find that place in between to figure out this is what we're doing, this is where we are going within our organization, where you have maybe some automated mechanisms to distribute identity and then the permissions that go with that. And these are not new concepts. You have permission boundaries to stop somebody from escalating privilege to something they're not supposed to have. But how do you continuously do something that, is fitting of your organization? So we spoke about the long-lived credentials, standing access to production, never right-sized, permissions that grew, actually scoping and having something, documented. Those little things. So if we were to put that in a quick poll, let's put that there. Or we can also put it up here because it makes sense. But let's also answer some questions, right? So we go to Sucrit. What happens if AI will automatically create its own input without any human concern? So this is the interesting thing. This is where you have the guardrails. This is where you have the security pieces in play, right? Because do you have the human in the loop functionalities? Do you have the permission guardrails in place where before something is, let's say, elevated into production or into non-prod or UAT or whatever environment, do you have the correct boundaries in place? These are the things that you have to have, because the concern that you're getting to is if something has access to do something without my knowledge. This is true for regular human developers as well, right? Can somebody make a change within the environment that I don't know about until it's too late? That's what we're trying to put into place with these actual boundaries. Victor also says, actually, this was a key for quality response. Yeah, quality response. Science is fun, and having boundaries and guardrails. Because part of that concern is that right now, permissions that grow, that continue to grow, standing access to production where something can access it without our knowledge. That's kind of where these trends, these conversations, these different worries come from, right? That's kind of the scariest permissions piece. So now let's talk about some ways. Let's speak about some ways of how we can go about just understanding. So there's a bunch of different items to consider, but first off, how do we break down the agentic AI, right? We're AI-driven detection and automated threat identification. These are powerful things that you can leverage within your organization because you're using essentially ML models and LLMs to generate, tune, and validate detection rules. Think of your guard duty findings or your Sigma rules, something along those lines, right? Instead of manually kind of tweaking and tuning yourself. This frees up your different security personas in order to handle the higher end items. like that overall target state that we're moving towards, right? Because part of this is, hey, how do we do something like reduce false positives? Well, we have to have something that's context aware, that understands our CloudTrail, our VPC full logs, our DNS telemetry, that knows our environment, that's kind of tweaked to us, right? So you want to go about it in a certain way. And these are the different pieces of the puzzle that you have to continuously adapt your detections to. Because from, let's say, a threat actor standpoint, they are also evolving with different tool sets. So you want your environment to evolve to help protect. We always speak about the basics, the defense in depth principles, making sure that you have some type of autonomous incident response workflow that has some decision-making capabilities. So the agents themselves, they help to enrich the findings from the guard duties and the security hubs and so on and so forth to help correlate the different signals and determine items without the human, let's say, triage components. That's why I take the pause. You may say, hey, without the human components for this piece of it, how do we know the information, the data, the different items that are coming in are correct for our interpretation? And that's where the basics still come into play. What pieces of data do you have? Do you have the structural components that we spoke about before? So if you recall, throughout this season, we've been kind of sprinkling in some of the basics of what World 1-1 looks like when you boot up your AWS environment. Well, it's making sure that you have the correct building blocks in place. Your control towers, your landing zones, your security policies, your preventative detective controls, your services. Key piece of that is things I was just mentioning. Are your CloudTrail logs up to date? Is your VPC flow logs on? Are you logging and keeping your VPC flow log somewhere? Have you taken it upon to kind of sort out, okay, I might not need all the VPC flow logs for optimization's sake. I may just need specific items within it. And then also DNS telemetry, your Route 53 resolver, those kind of things based on the incident response guidelines, right? Now you have those pieces of data captured. This is how you start to build out the different action and mechanisms that can be taken. Because if you include also guard duty finding security hub items, now you're starting to build a data set. You're starting to build out ways that your environment can evolve depending on what's occurring with it, while still having those guardrails, those boundaries, those boxes. Those are the areas that you want to continue to build, because now what you're focusing on is, hey, if something happens within my environment, do I have some type of automated containment action to, let's say, isolate EC2 instance or revoke IAM sessions or quarantine workflows? Those are different pieces of the puzzle that we need to get to. And we have, are you going to show architecture that shows where we need to add security? This is a key piece. And kind of, if we were to go off the rails a little bit, the different pieces of architecture come from the foundational pieces. So one of those areas is the security reference architecture, if I were to bring that up. So let us go off the rails a little bit. So if we look at the security reference architecture, let me share out and go from there. So security reference architecture, what you are essentially getting is that fundamental piece of it. So when you're looking at the SRA, hey, AI, ML security, these are the places that you're starting. This is where you think about the fundamental pieces of how everything goes into play, of having provable security and going through the different services. And you see each one of these areas within the SRA, within the prescriptive guidance, it tells you some of the things that you have to consider. right? As Victor says, identity and access management from the perspective of app interaction. Well, before you get to that, what you need to figure out is, okay, if we are going down the route of just the building blocks of design, this is where we need to start off with, hey, what is our organizational structure? What is our service policies look like? What are our preventative? Do we even have control tower? The questions go on and on. As you start to see, these are all considerations that you need to have. Because if you don't have these considerations built into your environment, then you can start to say, hey, which way are we going? That's the dramatic pause. Because if we have org management account, what services are we using here from the native side, right? We have the security hub, we have the different pieces of the puzzle of what makes up our environment. And to your point, what is control tower? Control tower, thank you for asking, is essentially the centralized location of all the different pieces of guidance principles, of known patterns, of everything that we can control our AWS organizations in optimized ways. And I said a lot of words because control towers, if you have a multi-account AWS organization, if you have control tower allows you to manage this appropriately. So if you have AWS organizations, you have the management account, you have the different ways to control and populate these different accounts with something like guard duty. If you want to push guard duty throughout your organization, these are the ways that you leverage control tower within the environment. And there's enhancements that you can have with the landing zone accelerator in order to say, hey, these are some known patterns that we want to inject in that we can have reusable. So when an account spins up, we are okay from a variety of different ways of networking, security, and resiliency, all those kind of items. So thank you for that. The other area to think about this from is if you have the foundations in place, what you're switching from is reactive to proactive. And as you start to delve into security agents, you're moving from that alert and wait SOC type model to a continuous autonomous defense loop. Because you start to have predictive posture management. So if something happens within your organization that's a misconfiguration, it remediates those items before, there's someone that comes into place that says, oh, this may be wrong. Well, you already have everything carved out because the time to alert, the time for somebody to triage, look into, figure out, the goal is getting to that self-healing infrastructure, because the time it takes to have a ticket triage, to have somebody take a look into it, and it might be a simple change. But if you were to cut out that piece, now you can worry about the overall architectural design considerations. And there's a balance in there. And that's where I said there was kind of layers to how you have the automation versus the human in the loop interactions. So when you think of how AI agents investigate, analyze, and execute security actions, you start to think about, okay, what are the reasoning frameworks that we're leveraging, right? What I mean by that is, how do we have, let's say, the agents themselves retrieve logs, form conclusions, the things that we kind of delve into as humans unknowingly, right? We just put the pieces together. And this is why it's definitely interesting. And this is why one of the topics this season was get excited. It's exhilarating, right? There's so many possibilities that you have, especially when you have agents in play, right? So the key piece I would say to take away to start off with is, right, understanding the basics, having something like control tower and your guardrails and your foundational items, which we have some episodes on that you can take a dive into and start to see how that's shaping or can shape your organization. Because this episode is about, hey, how do you level up? What is your next level? And as a security practitioner, if you were to try and understand what the next up, up, down, down, left, right is, well, the AWS security agent is kind of one of the places. Take a look, right? And for you who get that reference, 10 billion points to you, as I always like to say, because it's essentially something everybody knows, but not everybody knows the correct combinations to put into play. I like video game analogies, right? Because it's based on understanding, hey, what's something like the security agent? What does it do? Well, this is the interesting component and the interesting way to think about it, because it's essentially, AI-powered frontier agent designed to proactively secure your applications. This is a key part where some of the capabilities, you think of threat modeling, you think of automated code reviews, all these different items built into this. And as you start to learn and dive into these components, you start to see, oh, this is really great from every stage of development, because now you can get to the point of saying, hey, if we start to think about, all right, if we're threat modeling, what did we do right? What did go wrong? All those different items. What can we do better? Well, with the security agent, now during the planning phase, you can evaluate the architectural documentation in order to say, hey, we're planning these items and this is how things connect, and maybe in ways that we didn't expect before. So you're able to scale and go through those different pieces of the process. But other pieces, diving into the documentation of how it exactly works. I think this is a key component of this, because as you start to learn about the security agent, now you start to say, okay, I have to define the requirements. So what is your security team's organizational standards? Specific login requirements, your data access policies, your approved authorization libraries. These are the things that you start to build out, because as you start to take on and learn these different items of how they connect together, you're building out your end-to-end workflow. What I mean by that is your planning stage, your implementation phase, and what goes into that? Automated code reviews. That's a big piece, because you always want to have a second set of eyes. And if we're getting that from 10 billion years old, 10 billion points for that. Just going to keep going out there, and you get that reference. I get that reference. So thank you for that, Ari. As you start to go through and learn the different capabilities of security agent, those code reviews, let's say if you have a pull request from GitHub, just to understand basic vulnerabilities, like your SQL injections. Hey, maybe what is being leveraged within your current process procedures can be updated, can be powered up, can be leveled up. I'm going to keep saying that reoccurringly because it's an interesting concept, right? Because if the security agent finds a vulnerability or a violation of your policy that you have defined as your security team, now you have more options. You have a ready to implement remediation suggestion. And before, when you used to go through this, it'd be like, oh, what are the side effects? How do we do this? How do we go about this? Well, if you have the threat modeling component, if you have the integrations, if you have the user access, you start to see how powerful and how the future is starting to look here. Because first place I went is enable threat modeling. Because if I take the time out to say the amount of threat models as a security professional you do is a lot, and there's a tool that can assist you in doing those threat models well, that is kind of an interesting concept. Because what are you looking through when you're doing threat modeling? You're looking for the different attack vectors, how things are set up, identity, all these items that you have to have considerations for and also documentation for, because these are different pieces of the puzzle. And I would say Kiro CLI, yeah, it's a good starting point. I would say just learning about Kiro in general is a good starting point. Because as you start to go in and just tinker and understand, hey, what is Kiro CLI versus the actual IDE versus, okay, what is security agent doing? Well, do we understand kind of what a design spec is? How do we go about leveraging one? Those are different pieces of the puzzle, right? And thank you, as always, producer Jeff. Yeah, I would say start there. Go through that and just understand how you can play around and how you can get used to these different items. Because as you look forward with agentic AI in mind, you start to say, okay, the core principles are there. This is how I make the AI trustworthy to my organization. And I use those words specifically for the reason of when we have conversations with different customers, some of the hesitation is like, how do I know this is trustworthy? How do I know this isn't exposed? How do I know this won't push into production? Well, it's the basics of what you've been implementing within your organization, right? Your least privileged identity, your service control policy, your permission boundaries, your enforcement guardrails. These are all of the different pieces you put into play. Because if you take something as simple as permission boundaries, you're capping the maximum scope of any role a human or agent can ever assume. And this is where it gets interesting because it holds up a lot of the pieces of mirror, right, to the different security policies that there are in place. Because now you want to reevaluate, does everybody really need admin permissions that is doing administrative items? No, not really, right? Now you want to scope the permissions. Does everybody need the access to create identities or roles or something along those lines? And it also adds in that regular access review into your cycle because now you're looking at, all right, we need to prune some of these unused permissions. We have IAM access analyzed. Okay, great. Now we continue to do that. The cycle, the future, we keep looking towards it. We're trying to drive towards that North Star, which is of great security use. What are some of the other fundamentals? Networking, all right? Do we have segmentation? Do we have encryption and rest and in transit? These are the baselining guidelines that you go towards, right? You can have CIS benchmarks for these, but it's a continuation. It's an extension. That's why it's not really starting from fresh with leveraging agentic AI. This is just another skill set that's getting unlocked. Right? You're not deleting your character. All the experience points, the XP points that you've been building up, you're essentially leveraging that and saying, okay, now I have another tool set available to me that I have to explore. I have to go down this skill tree and I have to learn each piece one item at a time. But as I do, you don't really understand how powerful it becomes to your organizational security capabilities. Because being able to threat model faster, do code reviews faster, to be able to say, okay, I have these different capabilities, well, that leaves you open to asking different questions. It leads you down that science route that we spoke about the last couple of episodes of what is your hypothesis for your environment? How do I come up with a new one? Because now the task that I would have had to perform manually, I have something to take care of that piece of it, right? So somebody asked about control tower and AWS orgs. Well, landing zone helps you to put in guardrails automatically, right? So every new account gets this. Account vending happens a certain way. You have that clear OU hierarchy, right? The fundamentals. Now you start to ask the questions of what's next. And, kind of spoilers for the episode with that piece. But I think part of it is also understanding, hey, how do we take this up to the next level? Well, sometimes you have to go on some side quests and figure out what those side quests are through our segment called As Side Quest Legend Has It. And this is where I usually drop the, dramatic music. So I'll continue. So, As Side Quest Legend Has It is our segment of the show where we like to tell customer tales. I leave tech tales for another show, but customer tales, where we delve into different side quests in order to understand what is happening within the customer's environment. But before we go on the side quests, we have a question from a whisper. I was going to say whisper, but what do you think is the biggest technical barrier to giving AI secure real-time cloud context without exploring sensitive enterprise data? And to that question, I would say the biggest technical barrier is catching up the technical debt. What I mean by that is what we were just saying, the fundamental guardrails. Are they in place? Have they been reviewed up to the standards that, let's say, the security reference architecture, the well-architected framework, all those different pieces, do you have those in play with the different service tools and understanding identity? What do you have permission boundary? Those are the challenges, because sometimes organizations have to look back, and sometimes they're moving so fast that they're like, hey, we'll get back to that. We'll get back to that. And that's usually the challenge, because now you want to implement this, and this is just the next step. So is the foundation that you have built your organization on solid, or do you have more layers that you have to put into place? And that kind of goes along with your next question. What cloud security principle do you think transfers most directly into securing AI agents? I would say the cloud security principle, least privilege, right? And just understanding that guardrails need to be put into place from a human and machine identity role. So thank you for those questions, Matt. So the side quests, I think we could delve into that as well, because the side quest is essentially a visual representation of our customer story. So we have exactly what we like to speak about, and our board of the side quest variety, where we have, let's say, somewhat of a normal setup, a little bit sparing on the different AWS services, but we have the fundamentals of AWS environment and S3 bucket. And then what we have, authenticated user, unauthenticated users, right? It's usually a group of them. What we're trying to do is figure out if something were to happen where you have these unauthenticated users going into your environment, piece by piece, they are making their way towards you. What are the different mechanisms you usually have in place? The fundamentals, right? You might have something like simple. Hey, maybe we have a WAF there, right? And there's some authentication that happens. Some little bit of, how should I say, blocking, some drops, some, hey, if it's coming from this request, deny. Those little pieces in our organization. Well, what is our organization? Well, let's dive into that customer context. So picture this. Maybe we're migrating a telehealth platform, right? Let's call it Health Grid, right? Well Health Grid. Yeah, now go. So Well Health Grid, the migrating telehealth platform. And let's say they have a claim system. They have research pipelines that they moved to AWS 7 years ago. Yonder, I think that's where you throw that in. And they have automated responses. They have chaos validation, right? Maybe they even have a full forensics practice. So now, as they continue to grow, which is often the case, maybe they have over 50 connected hospitals. Maybe they have over 500K, active clinicians, devices, connected medical, all those kind of pieces. They have to follow the different frameworks, the different guidelines. Well, if you have this type of scenario, everything should be okay, right? And this is kind of where the music switches a little bit, because everything should be okay. but it doesn't. There's something where we said we had a closed life cycle. We had an autonomous agent. Actions have been logged. Remediation work have been correctly identified. But what was our gap? What are the different pieces we have to consider? Well, the pieces are maybe the agent identity was built on the same framework that was in place, where identity might have been a little bit of an afterthought, where autonomous agents now, they run on the same type of principles as the human counterparts of, hey, long-lived over-permission IAM roles shared across different research environments, different production environments, kind of violating that overarching least privilege mechanism. So the item that you're dealing with is not necessarily the, okay, we have a WAF. We're starting to think about, hey, maybe we have some identity challenges. Maybe we have some different just boundaries, guardrails, things with no real switches. Do we have multi-step actions that can be taken to prevent something? This is the case, especially if you have authenticated identities. Because our authenticated identities, hey, yeah, they access our environment. Which way? Well, that's a story for another episode. But what we're trying to get to is, all right, was there a human in the loop defined? Well, there's no policies that say, hey, I have an agent, I have a capability. And we are trying to figure out the next steps in this. So when you dive in, we take questions from the whispers in the chat. What's the most repetitive or frustrating workflow in cloud security today that feels like it should be automated? I would say that goes to threat model is a big piece of it. I think code reviews is a big piece of it, but lately that has been kind of taken care of in the sense from automation standpoint, an AI agentic AI workflow standpoint. And the questions come as well as developers spend a lot of time getting AI context. How do you see AI securely understand cloud environments without all the manual input? I would say all of that automation capability. So giving the different pieces of context for just your own understanding and eventually giving the data so that agents can handle appropriately, just like the security agent, with its threat modeling capabilities and its plan and steps and so on and so forth. But if we were to go back to our scenario, what is the verdict on Health Grid? Well, if we were trying to carve out our different pieces, what we found out is maybe there was an unknown workflow to give unauthenticated, let's say, agents or individuals access to things that they are not supposed to have access to. And this stems from that conversation of least privilege. And there's various mechanisms that we can put into place to understand. For instance, we can have, CloudTrail logs feeding into our agents to understand. We can have items like guard duty. We can have security hub layered on top. But even if we have all these pieces, the one piece that we have to take the moment to perform that dramatic pause, that step back, that what I call Zach Morris timeout, right? If we were to pause the game in our scenario, Health Grid, they have the different pieces in play, but the fundamental items weren't. When you think of agents having identity and least privilege, this is built off your own organization's least privilege pieces, where, hey, every agent should be scoped with short-lived credentials and managed life cycles, no sharing or standing access, right? Having human-in-the-loop functions, having that tiered autonomy, observe, suggest, act with approval. These are key pieces of the puzzle that you have to go about and understand. Because when you look at just the overarching picture of your environment, what does it look like? And I think part of it is taking that step back, looking at your environment, and also realizing, hey, the different risk categories that we had laid out for our environment, they're always evolving and changing. And one of the fears that we see is new risk categories are popping up. Now, if we have agents, are we adding that category to our organization? Well, as we said, it's just the extension of your existing environment. Identity from an agent standpoint, the authentication from an agent standpoint, from your autonomous systems, all plays into different parts of the equation. So treating each of your agents as first-class identities with unique, I should say, credentials is important. Because as you start to go down, as you start to think about, hey, what are the different pieces of the puzzle that I need to understand? Oh, it's scoped credentials, identity governance, the short-lived tokens. It's not new pieces of the puzzle. These are the pieces you sit back, you take a sip of your beverage of choice, and you say, yes, I've read this story before. I know what we should do. Implement the basics, the fundamentals, the guardrails, the policy as code pieces, the SCPs, the OPA, all those kind of things. Because these are the pieces of the puzzle that you're trying to get to. So, how do I continue down this path? Well, how do you understand the different behaviors? Are you scoping actions between your prod and non-prod and requiring elevation for sensitive operations? So if you have environmental awareness policies, now you can start to think of different ways to have non-prod and prod elevation capabilities, detection capabilities. These are all pieces of the puzzle. And this helps to separate if you're leveraging agents from a researching standpoint versus the regulated production, right? So the natural boundaries that you start to put in place with the guardrails, now you start to think about, hey, these are the different methodologies and different approaches that we need to take, right? So the other half of this is, do you have the correct, let's say, kill switches in place, right? Do you have the correct items to say, okay, if something were to happen with one of the agents, do you have something like rate limiting capping, where it limits how many actions the agent can take per window, or having auto disable pieces? Do you have the capabilities to limit and put boundaries on some of the developer actions? That all goes back to your target state security strategy and approval workflows, right? So if you were to take, let's say, a step function, for example, if you have a multi-called event-driven workflow where you have step functions, do you have the pausing capabilities for that human to say, yes, do this? I know in the landing zone accelerator, if you have a pipeline, for example, before something goes in and gets merged, you would have the approval gate. Same thing in GitHub, the same thing in different coding methodologies. You want to make sure that the sensitive workflows have some type of mechanism that suits your overall organizational guidance. And remember, observe, suggest, act for approval. These are key steps that you're going to want to implement. Right? This is how you graduate your trust levels within your environment. It's how you get individuals comfortable with how your workflows get carried out. And I think different pieces of the play, right, along with the different questions of, do you like Winget CM? Victor, you're always great with coming up with these different questions, right? I would like to know your opinion. Do you like Winget CMD? And for Matt, I would also like to know, best cloud security engineers understand that most engineers don't. And I would say that question goes back to, it's always the basics. That's the thing. It's never the tool set in general. It's, do you know the basics of what the tool is supposed to perform? I would answer that as one of the questions, Matt. But what I would ask back to chat is, what is your biggest blocker to safely adopting agentic AI? Is it your foundations aren't ready? Is it something along the lines of, hey, I'm not ready? Or is it no guardrails in place? Or no human in the loop? I know these are often questions that we ask ourselves, but I'd like to know from chat. Feel free to put it in, and I also put up a poll to ask as well, because these are always interesting. Because when you start to go through the answers, it usually comes down to, we didn't think about it yet. But prove me wrong or prove me right, whichever way. I heard it both ways. So here, put up the poll for everybody to decide upon, and let's go from there. So what is the biggest blocker to safely adopt agentic AI within your organization? Feel free, put 1, 2, 3, or 4. I'd like to know. And this also ties into one of the last areas of organizational readiness itself, right? And how exactly you're going to, prepare your organization. And it's kind of like a trick question based on everything I was saying before, is you're getting prepared by essentially doing everything one XP point at a time. But without spoilers, what you want to do is assess your current security maturity level. You want to make sure that you understand the current gaps or the current places that you're trying to improve, and benchmark against existing AWS frameworks, or just frameworks in general. I know there's a security maturity model, there's a NIST CSF, but when it comes to these pieces, okay, how are you scoring each life cycle against that defined maturity model? How are you identifying which stage that you're AI ready or that you need additional hardening? How do you establish a baseline? I think it's all questions we like to ask. And hopefully we can start to say, hey, we have the answers, but it's all steps along the way. These are, those random pieces. And if we go through, yes, mixture of options, just token elevation. And Aries says, to be fair, 4, but I'm leadership in my stuff. Yep. These are all pieces to consider, right? There's no right or wrong answer. There's just what's right for your organization based on understanding what's in your security posture, what's in your environment, what resources are you using, how are you managing identities, what frameworks are you adhering to? Do you have the established guardrails and safety controls in place? And are they codified so that they're testable, version, enforced consistently? Because one of the things, if I were to go on the quick rant, is when you make changes that are not verifiable or not repeatable exactly, and enforced with consistency by leveraging something like IAC, what tends to happen is, 1, rant, but 2, something is missed. And it could be a simple thing, right? It could be, okay, we didn't make this one change, but that one change, you wait a little bit, turns into 2 changes, then it turns into 3 changes. And then before you know, there's drift in the configurations because we made exceptions here, or we did this, or this user needed an elevated role for whatever reason. Now you start to say the guardrails are not applied across all the environments. But you most often see this when you have a lot of acquisitions, right? AKA a lot of AWS accounts kind of get smashed together. Now you have different principles. And if you don't have a clear, repeatable method that could be injected into an environment, now you start to have these different version controls of, okay, this environment is part legacy, but this one also is kind of legacy. And now they're all operating at different levels. So when you try to define or put into place some different pieces of the puzzle saying, hey, something as simple as service control policy or permission boundaries, now you start to run into, oh, this doesn't work in this environment. So now we have to design something. And this is how the tech debt starts to grow within the organization. So what do? Well, one of the things to, prevent from going fast is dive into different pieces of documentation, to go into understanding, as we like to do always, the certifications, certificate knowledge, but also the knowledge quests, because the knowledge quest is where you dive into the actual material, after you grab, your beverage of choice, coffee, tea, or water, your 5 a.m. run, all that good stuff. You say, hey, what's going on in the AWS world? And you say, hey, there's some cool documentation, some known patterns, some ways that I can build Aura. That's what knowledge quests are for. They're building Aura. But it's also understanding how to shift left and how to, understand the phantom permission mystery. I could keep going all day, but I'll digress, because in this show, the Safe Room Feature Security Side Quest, what we like to do is level each piece of information. So within the L100, when you're just an agent apprentice, you start to figure out, okay, what does an agent apprentice need to know? What is concrete for them to say, hey, I am currently at this level, and I want to continue to maybe level up myself? That's a good question. Where do you start with that? Feel free to put it in chat, because I'm going to show you as well. So you take that step, and what we will do is display what an agent apprentice does. And when you see it, you're going to say, hey, is this all? And I'm going to say yes. As I stall for time, as my computer continues to load. But the agent apprentice essentially goes down and reads the documentation to say, okay, what does the security reference architecture say? What are the different pieces that we need to know? Do I know the value of the SRA? Also, they tend to know, hey, what is Identity Center? And how do we handle identities within our organization? This is the key place, because you start to ask these questions as an apprentice. You start to say, okay, we understand our organization has this in place. This is how we leverage identity. This is how we do networking. This is how we cater to our different environments. So if we're looking at, all right, I understand what Identity Center is, I can also understand some of the prescriptive guidance patterns, so that we get to the place where eventually we take the time to level up and become a power-up engineer. Yes, a power-up engineer essentially is when you dive into things, you start to understand piece by piece, so that you know the prescriptive patterns. You know how to say, hey, what is, machine learning within AWS? How do I secure it? How do I understand security identity compliance? And if we were to dive into that, how do we automate incident response forensics? How do we automatically validate something? These are the key pieces of the puzzle. Because if you deploy Control Tower, do you know this pattern? Well, there's the step-by-step procedures on how you can delve into this by yourself, which is interesting, right? Because when you go down this route of discovery and you go from that agent apprentice to power-up engineer, by the time you go through and take everything piece by piece, eventually, you'll be that final stage architect. And the final stage architect gets to the point where you say, hey, I kind of see how our environment is shaped. I kind of see the direction that we're going. So when I look at ways to automate our tasks and applications, this is one of the places of using, Bedrock agents, but there's more specifically the frontier agents with security agent and delivery agent. These are different pieces of the puzzle that you can start to figure out how I can level up my entire environment. Because I know the fundamentals. I know the capabilities of these different services. And that's the key thing, is to become that final stage architect. You have to know the ebb and flow of your environment. Because what goes into a good environment? Same stuff that goes into a good game. It's the story that you're telling along the way. It's the side quests that you have along the way. Because can you just have the main functionalities in place? Yes. But what makes your environment kind of grow over time and be prepared for agentic AI or the next level of AWS security is understanding the fundamentals. It's saying, I kind of pieced each of these areas together because I knew how the story was going to play out. And that story is your target state security strategy that you built through step-by-step process and procedures, looking at the known patterns, till you got to a point where you said, hey, now I can have these AI agents help with these different use cases, where now my developers can have a workflow because I have something like the security agent to help out, doing threat models, doing code reviews. This frees us up to think about our story arc. It frees us up to think about, hey, what is the North Star that we are moving towards? Are we still on the same path? Or do we need to continually evolve it? It's all great questions. And the main thing to say is just keep learning, keep reading, keep deep diving, right? Because the key part to agentic AI and that next level of AWS security is to keep up with everything that is occurring one piece at a time. Because every article you read, every pattern that you implement, every resource that you spin up is that one XP point that helps you to level up your security knowledge, yourself, but also your overall organization, security posture, so that you keep setting the, pieces in motion to level up yourself some more. Because what's fun in the game? When you have new game plus. And it applies to security because it's a cycle, especially when you think about your incident response plan, which I like to say here. So until next time, thank you. This is the season finale. Keep leveling up yourself. Keep going on side quests. Keep having fun and using fun analogies, whether they be video game, anime, or anything in between. So until next time, till we see, I'll see you, Space Cowboy. Take care. Have fun. Cheers. All that good stuff.